That's Craig Kelly, who's a Liberal backbencher. As you heard there, raising the issue of hazard reduction burns. The Prime Minister has also said that's the main thing he's been hearing from people in affected communities. So let's speak to an expert on hazard reduction burning. Phil Zylstra is a landscape flammability expert and an adjunct professor at Curtin University. Phil Zylstra, thank you so much for joining us on RM Breakfast. What do you make of Craig Kelly's comments?
Look, it really comes down, I think, to whether you're going to take the word of scientific experts around the world or of the chair of the Parliamentary Friends of Australian Coal Exports. What he's saying misses so many of the points. He's, I suppose, confusing a lot of the science. He's working with perhaps his own understanding of these things, but we've got a simple reality. We've got record drought conditions, allowing for fires that have broken all records so far beyond what we've seen. And this comes at the peak of a record period of prescribed burning. It's completely false to say that there has been a lack of prescribed burning. Prescribed burning rates have increased markedly. In New South Wales, the last decade has seen more than twice the amount of prescribed burning compared to the decade before. And in all mapped records of prescribed burning across New South Wales national parks, it's the highest decade.
Okay, so it has increased dramatically, but has it increased enough?
Well, that's the interesting question. I suppose it depends on who you ask. Nobody can give a very clear answer on what is enough. The issue of what defines the amount of prescribed burning that we do is it's not so much about hectares. That's where we've been caught on this. It's about where you do the burning. All of the studies so far have shown that prescribed burning is effective if done within about 500 metres of assets. This is the unpopular reality of it, is there's not yet any empirical evidence to show that large areas of remote prescribed burning have had any effect on reducing house loss. So if we invest in burning hectares, then the easy thing is to burn those in remote areas where they don't work. But if we invest in a strategic approach, we actually get less hectares burnt, but they're in places where they will make a difference.
Okay, in the Black Saturday Royal Commission, there was a fairly specific recommendation about the amount of backburning that should be done in Victoria, 358,000 hectares per year. Have we been hitting that mark?
I don't think anybody's been quite able to hit that mark, and that is quite a telling reality. The fact is that there are no areas of green tape or controls that have stopped that from happening. It's the simple fact that the window of opportunity for doing these burns is shrinking as the climate warms and the landscape dries. So if we try to hit that hectare target, the only way to do it is to burn in increasingly dangerous conditions where you have burns escaping and you start creating the bushfires yourself.
Okay, I can understand that the shortening window of opportunity makes it more challenging, but does the simple fact that we haven't been able to do as much hazard reduction burning as the Royal Commission said we should give reasonable rise to the view that we haven't done enough?
Not at all. Since that time, there's been a reassessment of that, which has shown that we do need to move towards a more strategic approach, that hectares has been an ineffective approach and that we need to focus on burning close to assets. There's also the other reality, which is the main area that I've worked on, where prescribed burning is not necessarily a strategy that reduces the hazard in all forest types. We've got a very simplistic cultural view of fire in Australia that we really need to grow out of. We treat the Australian bush as if it's all just the bush, with one simple rule of thumb for the whole lot. The reality is that forests respond to fires in different ways. So what I found across the mountains of southeastern Australia was that for every forest I examined, we had 2 periods of reduced fire hazard. We had a couple of years straight after we burnt them. Then we had a couple of decades of greatly increased fire hazard where all of the shrubs grew and we had dense undergrowth. Then after those decades, those shrubs thinned and we went back into a long-term period of reduced hazard in old forests. So if we start using that sort of science, which is not theoretical, it's a measured empirical reality from our history. If we start using that science, then it gives us two options instead of one. We can focus on burning close to assets where it's shown to be helpful, but we can manage those remote areas into their lower flammability states that they reach as old growth forests.
To put this whole debate in practical terms, I was out near the Waitalaba fire in early November where 2 people died, and I was on this big property with a farmer there, and the fire came right up to the edge of his property, and he was one of these people saying that I live next to this massive nature reserve, and nowhere near enough is being done to reduce the hazard in that forest and then affect the risk coming onto my property. In practical terms, what should be happening there, and are his complaints valid?
Firstly, there's always that perception around fires. I remember after the 2003 fires in Kosciuszko, there was a 7-fold increase in prescribed burning within the park, but there was the perception in the community that nothing had changed. And part of the reason for that is that people can't see what's being done in these remote areas. So there's a perception that there's not enough if something goes wrong. The other part of it is that there needs to be those treatments close to his property. But again, the science, the facts on the matter show that treatments in remote areas will not reduce the risk to his property in any way that we've been able to measure so far.
What do you mean by that? Do you mean burning deep inside that bush? Because he was talking about the fringes of that nature reserve.
Yep. There's a place for burning along the fringes. I don't know his specific example. But again, if we were to move away from a hectare target and towards a strategic approach, then there would be an increased focus on burning those fringes.
Okay. And Phil, you mentioned earlier that we need a more nuanced understanding of the different kinds of bushland and how they should be treated when it comes to hazard reduction burning. What do we need to understand about the different kinds of Australian bush and how they should be treated?
Our First Nations had an approach towards fire where your understanding of fire was completely specific to country. You may be an expert in fire in your area, but as soon as you cross the river into somebody else's country, you need to come in there humble and learn their approach. We haven't had that approach. We've stepped in here and brought an English approach of clearing country by fire across vast landscapes. We need to step back and recognise that we actually don't really know very much about fire in Australia and start looking at what is the response of an individual plant community. How do the shrubs respond? Does it germinate a flush of shrubs? Do these thin as the forest ages? And look at how that affects the long-term flammability. Because the reality is, even if a 2-year-old prescribed burn will prevent a bushfire from spreading, and most of them haven't been, I have to say, across this fire season. The fires have just been burning through last year's prescribed burns and the years before. But even if they do work, you simply can't burn the whole landscape every couple of years. You have to have other strategies for remote areas.